Have you ever felt so desperate that you poured out your heart to God in ways that others couldn't understand? Today we're diving into one of the most powerful stories of faith, persistence, and answered prayer found in the Bible. This is the incredible journey of Hannah, a woman whose tears turned into triumph, whose barrenness became a blessing, and whose broken heart birthed one of Israel's greatest prophets. Get ready to discover how Hannah's story can transform your own prayer life and deepen your faith in ways you never imagined. Picture this scene. A woman kneels in the sacred tabernacle, her lips moving silently, tears streaming down her face as she whispers desperate words to the Almighty. She's been coming here year after year, carrying the same burden, the same heartache, the same unfulfilled longing. But today something is different. Today, her prayer will shake the very foundations of heaven and change the course of history. This is Hannah's story, and it's about to teach us everything we need to know about the power of persistent, heartfelt prayer. Let me take you back to ancient Israel, during the time of the Judges, when the nation was spiritually adrift and God's voice had become rare in the land. In the hill country of Ephraim lived a man named Elkanah who loved God and faithfully made the yearly pilgrimage to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice. Elkanah had 2 wives, which was common practice in those days, though not God's ideal design. His first wife was named Peninnah, and she had given him several children. His second wife was Hannah, whom he loved dearly, but she remained childless. Now you might think having 2 wives would solve any fertility issues, but this arrangement created a household filled with tension, jealousy, and heartbreak. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 2 tells us that Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. In that culture, a woman's worth was largely measured by her ability to bear children, especially sons. Children were considered a direct blessing from God, while childlessness was often viewed as a sign of divine displeasure or curse. Imagine Hannah's daily life. Every morning she would wake up to the sounds of Peninnah's children playing, laughing, and calling for their mother. She would see the pride in Elkanah's eyes when he looked at his sons and daughters, knowing she could never give him that joy. The cultural shame was overwhelming, but even worse was the personal grief of a woman who desperately wanted to hold her own baby, to nurture and love a child of her own. But here's where the story takes a particularly painful turn. Peninnah wasn't content with simply having children while Hannah remained barren. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 6 tells us that her rival used to provoke her severely to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. The Hebrew word used here for provoke means to thunder against or to vex with words. Peninnah would deliberately remind Hannah of her childless state, making cruel comments and hurtful observations designed to wound Hannah's already broken heart. Think about someone in your own life who has used your deepest pain as ammunition against you. Maybe it's a family member who constantly reminds you of your failures, a friend who highlights your insecurities, or a coworker who seems to delight in your struggles. Hannah faced this cruelty not occasionally, but continuously, from someone who shared her own household, her own husband, her own dinner table. The text tells us this harassment went on for years. Every year when the family would make their pilgrimage to Shiloh to worship, Peninnah would intensify her taunting. Perhaps she would make comments about how blessed she was to have children to bring before the Lord, or how surely God must be angry with Hannah to keep her barren for so long. The very place that should have been Hannah's refuge, the house of God, became a place where her pain was magnified. Elkanah, to his credit, tried to comfort his wife. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 8, we see him asking Hannah why she was crying, why she wouldn't eat, and why her heart was grieved. He says to her, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" While his intentions were loving, his words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Hannah's pain. He couldn't comprehend that his love, while precious to her, could not fill the void she felt as a childless woman in that society. This is such a human moment, isn't it? How many times have we tried to comfort someone by minimizing their pain or suggesting that what we offer should be enough for them? Elkanah loved Hannah deeply, but he couldn't understand her specific heartache. Sometimes the people who love us most still can't fully grasp our deepest struggles, and that's when we must turn our hearts completely toward God. Hannah had reached her breaking point. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 10 tells us she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. The Hebrew phrase for bitterness of soul is incredibly strong, describing someone whose very essence is filled with grief and despair. This wasn't just sadness. This was the kind of deep, soul-crushing pain that makes you question everything you thought you knew about God's goodness and faithfulness. But here's what makes Hannah's story so remarkable. Instead of turning away from God in her pain, she turned toward Him. Instead of becoming bitter against the Lord who had closed her womb, she brought her bitterness to Him in prayer. This is one of the most important lessons we can learn from Hannah's life. When we're hurting, our natural tendency might be to distance ourselves from God, to question His love, or to seek comfort in things that ultimately don't satisfy. Hannah shows us a different way. She made her way to the tabernacle at Shiloh, to the very presence of God, and there she poured out her heart like never before. The text describes her as praying to the Lord while weeping in anguish. This wasn't a polite, composed prayer. This was raw, desperate, honest communication with her Creator. She held nothing back, hiding none of her pain, masking none of her desperation. And then Hannah did something that would change everything. She made a vow to God. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 11, she promises that if the Lord would look upon her affliction and remember her, and give her a male child, she would give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor would come upon his head. This was an incredible commitment. Hannah wasn't just asking for a son to ease her personal pain or to gain social acceptance. She was offering to dedicate this child completely to God's service as a Nazirite, meaning she would give up the very thing she longed for most. Think about the faith this required. Hannah was essentially saying to God, I want this child so desperately that I'm willing to give him back to you completely. She wasn't trying to bargain with God or manipulate Him into blessing her. She was surrendering her deepest desire to His will and purposes. This is the kind of prayer that moves heaven because it aligns our hearts with God's heart, seeking His glory above our own comfort. As Hannah prayed with such intensity, something interesting happened. Eli the priest, who was sitting by the doorpost of the Lord's temple, began watching her. He noticed that her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. In that culture, prayers were typically offered aloud, so Eli assumed Hannah was drunk. Can you imagine? Here's a woman pouring out her heart to God in the most sincere prayer of her life, and she's accused of being intoxicated. Eli's response reveals how far the spiritual leadership of Israel had fallen. Instead of discerning the spiritual hunger in Hannah's prayer, he made a superficial judgment based on external appearances. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 14 records his rebuke. How long will you make yourself drunk? Put your wine away from you. These words must have felt like another dagger in Hannah's already wounded heart. But watch Hannah's gracious response. Instead of becoming defensive or angry, she gently corrects Eli's misunderstanding. In verse 15 she explains, No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. She doesn't rebuke Eli for his hasty judgment. She simply tells her truth and explains that her prayer comes from deep sorrow, not from drunkenness. Hannah continues in verse 16, saying, Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now. What a beautiful way to describe authentic prayer. Hannah had spoken out of the abundance of her complaint and grief. She had held nothing back from God, bringing Him her raw emotions, her honest struggles, her deepest longings. When Eli realized his mistake, he offered Hannah a blessing that would prove prophetic. In verse 17 he tells her, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of Him. Something about Eli's words resonated deep in Hannah's spirit. For the first time in years, peace began to fill her heart. She thanked Eli and went her way, and the text tells us she ate and her face was no longer sad. This is remarkable. Hannah hadn't received her answer yet. She wasn't pregnant. Her circumstances hadn't changed at all. But something had shifted in her spirit through the act of pouring out her heart to God and receiving a word of blessing from His priest. Sometimes the breakthrough isn't in getting what we want immediately, but in finding peace while we wait, in trusting that God has heard our cry and will answer in His perfect timing. The family returned home to Ramah, and there something beautiful happened. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 19 tells us that Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. The phrase "the Lord remembered her" is loaded with significance. When the Bible says God remembers, it doesn't mean he had forgotten and suddenly recalled. It means he acted with intention and purpose on behalf of someone he loves. God had heard every prayer Hannah had prayed over the years. He had seen every tear she had shed. He knew the depth of her longing and the sincerity of her faith. And now, in his perfect timing, he chose to open her womb and bless her with the child she had longed for. By the end of that year, Hannah had conceived and given birth to a son, whom she named Samuel, saying, "Because I have asked for him from the Lord." The name Samuel means heard by God or asked of God, and it became a permanent reminder of how God had answered Hannah's desperate prayer. Every time Hannah called her son's name, she was reminded of God's faithfulness. Every time someone spoke to Samuel, they were declaring that this child was a direct answer to prayer, a testimony to God's goodness and power. But Hannah's story doesn't end with the joy of receiving her long-awaited child. Remember the vow she had made to God in her desperation. She had promised that if God gave her a son, she would dedicate him completely to the Lord's service. Now that Samuel was here, filling her arms and her heart with joy, would she keep that promise? This is where Hannah's character truly shines. When the time came for the yearly pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah chose to stay home with baby Samuel. She told her husband in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 22 that she would not go up until the child was weaned, and then she would take him so that he might appear before the Lord and remain there forever. Hannah used these precious years to pour into Samuel, to teach him about the God who had answered her prayer, to prepare him for the life of service that awaited him. She knew these years were a gift, borrowed time before she would fulfill her vow. And when Samuel was weaned, probably around 3 or 4 years old, Hannah did the unthinkable. She took her precious son, her miracle baby, her answered prayer, and she brought him to the tabernacle to give him to God permanently. Picture this scene. Hannah walks into the same place where she had wept so bitterly years before, but now she carries her young son by the hand. She approaches Eli, who probably doesn't recognize her at first. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 26, she reminds him of their previous encounter, saying, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition which I asked of him." And then she speaks the words that reveal the incredible depth of her faith and surrender. In verse 28 she declares, "Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord." The Hebrew word translated as lent here means to dedicate or consecrate completely. Hannah wasn't giving Samuel to God reluctantly or with strings attached. She was joyfully fulfilling the promise she had made, recognizing that this child belonged to God anyway. Can you imagine the strength this required? Hannah had waited years for this child, had treasured every moment with him, and now she was placing him in the care of a priest whose own sons were corrupt and rebellious. She was trusting God completely with her most precious possession, believing that his plans for X. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of Hannah's story for us to embrace. It's one thing to pray desperately for something we want. It's another thing entirely to be willing to surrender that thing back to God when he grants it to us. Hannah's example challenges us to examine our own prayers and motivations. Are we seeking God's blessings for our own comfort and happiness, or are we willing to receive his gifts and use them for his glory? The text tells us that after leaving Samuel at the tabernacle, Hannah and Elkanah worshiped the Lord and returned home. You might expect her to be heartbroken, but instead we find Hannah breaking into one of the most beautiful songs of praise in all of Scripture. 1 Samuel chapter 2 begins with Hannah's prayer of thanksgiving, where she declares, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord." Hannah's song reveals the transformation that had taken place in her heart. She had learned to find her identity and worth, not in her circumstances, but in her relationship with God. She had discovered that God's goodness isn't measured by what he gives us, but by who he is. Her praise focuses on God's character, his sovereignty, his justice, and his power to transform lives. In her song, Hannah declares prophetic truths about God's nature. She says in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 3, "Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed." Perhaps she was thinking of Peninnah's years of taunting, Or maybe she was simply overwhelmed by the realization that God sees and knows everything, including our motives and the condition of our hearts. Hannah continues in verse 4, declaring that the bows of the mighty men are broken, and those who stumbled are girded with strength. She had experienced this truth personally. When she was weak and broken, God had strengthened her. When she felt defeated by circumstances and cruel words, God had lifted her up and given her victory. One of the most powerful verses in Hannah's song comes in verse 7, where she proclaims, "The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and lifts up." Hannah understood that God is sovereign over all circumstances and that our current situation is not our final destination. She had lived through seasons of sorrow and shame, and now she was experiencing joy and honor, all according to God's perfect timing and plan. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Hannah's story is what happened after she left Samuel at the tabernacle. You might think that giving up her only son would mark the end of her blessings, but God had more in store for Hannah. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 21 tells us that the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. God didn't just replace what Hannah had given up. He multiplied her blessings beyond what she could have imagined. The woman who had once been barren became the mother of 6 children. The woman who had been mocked and ridiculed for her childlessness became known as the mother of one of Israel's greatest prophets. God's math is different from ours. When we give sacrificially to Him, He often returns far more than we ever offered. Every year when Hannah and Elkanah made their pilgrimage to Shiloh, they would see Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 19 tells us that Hannah would make him a little robe each year and bring it to him when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Can you picture this tender scene? Hannah would spend months carefully crafting a new robe for her growing son, praying for him as she worked, anticipating their brief reunion. These annual visits must have been both joyful and bittersweet for Hannah. She could see how Samuel was growing in wisdom and stature, how God was preparing him for his calling as prophet, priest, and judge over Israel. But she also had to say goodbye again each year, trusting God with her son's daily care and training. Samuel's life validated Hannah's faith and sacrifice in remarkable ways. He became the last and greatest of the judges, the prophet who anointed both Saul and David as kings of Israel, the spiritual leader who helped transition Israel from the chaotic period of the judges into the monarchy. The son Hannah gave to God became instrumental in establishing the dynasty from which the Messiah would eventually come. But Samuel's character also reflected the kind of mother Hannah had been during his early years. He was known for his integrity, his close relationship with God, his faithfulness in ministry, and his courage in confronting sin even among leaders. The foundation Hannah laid during Samuel's first few years of life shaped him into the man who would shape a nation. Hannah's story provides us with a powerful template for authentic prayer and radical faith. First, she teaches us that it's okay to bring our deepest pain and most desperate needs to God. We don't have to clean up our emotions or put on a spiritual facade when we come before the Lord. He can handle our tears, our frustrations, our honest questions, and our raw desperation. Second, Hannah shows us the power of persistent prayer. She didn't give up after a year or two of unanswered prayer. She continued to seek God faithfully, year after year, believing that He heard her cries and would answer in His perfect timing. In our instant culture, we often expect immediate answers from God, but Hannah's example reminds us that some of God's greatest blessings come to those who wait faithfully. Third, Hannah demonstrates the importance of surrendering our desires to God's will. Her vow to dedicate Samuel to the Lord wasn't made lightly or in a moment of desperation that she later regretted. She kept her promise even when it cost her dearly, recognizing that God's purposes are always higher than our own plans. Finally, Hannah's life illustrates how God can transform our greatest struggles into our most powerful testimonies. The years of barrenness and pain that seemed like such a waste became the very foundation for one of the most influential lives in biblical history. God doesn't waste our wounds. He uses our deepest hurts to prepare us for our greatest purposes. As we reflect on Hannah's incredible journey, we're challenged to examine our own prayer lives and faith. Are we bringing our authentic selves to God, Or are we trying to impress him with spiritual-sounding words? Are we persistent in prayer, even when answers seem slow in coming? Are we willing to surrender our deepest desires to God's will, trusting that his plans are better than our own? Hannah's story reminds us that the God who heard her desperate cry still hears our prayers today. He still sees our tears, knows our struggles, and works all things together for the good of those who love him. The same God who opened Hannah's womb and blessed her with Samuel is able to work miracles in our lives when we approach him with faith, persistence, and surrender. Whether you're struggling with infertility like Hannah, facing criticism and judgment from others, dealing with broken dreams, or simply feeling distant from God, remember that he sees you, he hears you, and he has good plans for your life. Your current chapter is not your final story, and your present pain is not your permanent condition. Hannah's example encourages us to pour out our hearts to God, to wait faithfully for his timing, to surrender our desires to his will, and to trust that he is working even when we can't see what he's doing. Her story proves that no prayer offered in faith is ever wasted, no tear shed in trust is ever forgotten, and no sacrifice made in love is ever unrewarded. The woman who once wept in anguish at the tabernacle became a mother, a worshiper, and ultimately a testament to God's faithfulness that has inspired millions of believers throughout history. Hannah's story is still being written today in the lives of all who choose to trust God with their deepest longings, greatest fears, and most precious dreams. What chapter will you write in your own story of faith?